one of the things that people need to remember as investors, right, is that there's two sides to the debt to income ratio. There's debt and there's income.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the income side, because you've said like the income side is relatively fixed, but I would imagine if you've got a high yielding portfolio that it would impact your income level. How does that come into play?
That's such a good question, right? So people don't really understand how yields matter, right? Let's say you buy a $500,000 property, right? And it's got $400,000 of debt on it. And then let's just say that property produces $15,000 of revenue, of income, right? Gross income, right? You're going to get an income multiple on that revenue that create relative to the debt. But if you buy a $500,000 property that produces $30,000 of income, same property, higher yield, right? The multiple is going to be higher. So you might get a 5 or a 6 times income multiple. So the debt to income ratio. So for example, for every dollar you earn, you get a multiple of that in debt, right? So if I earn $100,000, I can get access to $600,000 of debt. If your property produces, let's say $30,000 of gross revenue, it will give you a multiple of another 6 times that in available debt, which would be $180,000. Okay. Now, obviously, there's some shading and some risk buffers and some other stuff that goes on there, but for simplicity's sake, to explain the impact of yields, let's say you buy a $500,000 property, and you've got access to $400,000 of debt, right? Let's just say you've got a borrowing capacity of $400,000 and you're buying a $500,000 property, right? That's the quantum we're working with. If you buy a $500,000 property that produces $15,000 of gross rental income, that $15,000 would add to your personal income statement for the year. I'm oversimplifying this, right? This is not financial advice. I'm just trying to illustrate a point. The $15,000 would be added to your personal income statement for the year, in a sense, right? And then there would be a multiple applied on that of, let's say, 6 times. So that'll give you an extra $90,000 of potential borrowing capacity. Again, oversimplified. There's some other stuff in there, but that $15,000 would give you $90,000 of additional borrowing capacity, right? If you were to do the same thing and buy a $500,000 property with $30,000 of gross income, that $30,000 of gross income would give you $180,000 of additional borrowing capacity, right? So when you start thinking about this is how investors, which focus on slightly higher yields, are able to game the system, because they're able to continue moving forward when other people aren't, not by over leveraging, but by affecting the income side of the debt to income ratio. So it's not about stretching yourself beyond your means. It's about working out how to play the game of finance and use properties in a way that are going to help accelerate your portfolio and make sure that you don't get stuck. And the other added benefit of buying slightly higher yield properties is that if and when interest rates do increase, there's a greater buffer actually built into your portfolio if you to tolerate any of those kind of fluctuations, which means that you're not going to be exposed to risk. You know, it means that you're actually going to be in a position to be able to weather any kind of storms. And as we've discussed previously in another episode, we actually discussed the fact that when interest rates rise, rents rise too, right? Because affordability changes. And as inflation rises and wages start to go up because of employment shortages, rents are going to increase too, right? So if you start by buying properties which are, you know, over 5.5% yield, you're going to be in a way better position. You've got to remember the national median yield is only 3.9%. So most people are buying properties which they can't afford to hold, right? Particularly if something happens to their job or if something happens to interest rates, versus, you know, intelligent investors, you know, the ones that we work with who are buying properties which are cash flow positive and supporting all of their own debt and actually are contributing to increasing their borrowing capacity, not decreasing it.
It's really interesting because I think a lot of people would think that, you know, it's the net cash flow for a year. So let's just say it's $1,000 net cash flow in a year. It's like stack that on top of your personal income and you think, well, that doesn't really change a whole deal. And so people think about that with like positive gearing, positive cash flow properties, that, you know, I'll go down this strategy, but for what? I'll get an extra $1,000. That's not going to like revolutionize my borrowing capacity, but it's actually more about the growth income and its multiple effect on adding to your borrowing capacity, which I think that's a game changer way to think about it for a lot of people.
So 100%, right? So the simplest way to think about this is if you were to buy a property that produced $30,000 of gross rental income, right? Now, let's just say that's the static. Let's say that you're buying a property which will produce $30,000 of gross rental income. If that property purchase, right, is $1 million property, then the amount of debt that you require to purchase that property compared to the income that property produces is way out of whack. Vice versa, if you flip that around and bought a $100,000 property, which produced $30,000 of income, the amount of debt to income is going to be completely opposite, right? So you're going to be producing shitloads of income for a very nominal amount of debt, right? And this is the literal impact of focusing on yields, right? So if you're buying a $200,000 property or a $700,000 property, it sort of doesn't really matter. What you really want to look at is, what you really want to be thinking about is like, how does this contribute to my debt to income profile, right? Because this is where most people get stuck. Now, again, oversimplified it, and again, not financial advice. Go speak to your broker, all of that kind of stuff.